Hello. It has been a while. I feel like I say that every time because it is truly wild. Truly, my internet's really having a bad time, but I'm here, and I guess that's okay. Um, so many things have happened since I was last streaming. I don't know that I was talking last time. I think about how we figured out why I was tired all the time. Turns out, don't have enough blood. So I had to take B12 injections. I had to take vitamin D for a bit. Um, didn't do anything. I maybe have more blood now than then, but I still feel terrible. I was on a blood glucose monitor, continuous blood glucose monitor for a while. That was fun. Uh, great having to like scan yourself in public when it was in a really awkward place on my arm. So like you had to like just pull my arm up in the air, like scan the glucose monitor with my phone, the way that you use your phone to pay for things. And it was very interesting experience. I think if I have to do it again, I'm gonna make them put it on the outside of my arm and not the inside because I knocked it so many times when it was on the inside of my arm. Uh, it truly was interesting. But what we're here for is to read my book, and I do not have it prepared. Just like a truly smart professional stream. Let me find where it is. Just, casually forgetting about your own thing. Hope everyone's been fine in this uh, gulf between my appearances. Because truly, I stream like as often as there is an eclipse. Because it's been so long, I had to go back through the old stream, the last stream that I did of the book to find out what chapter I was on. And we're shockingly at chapter 50. I don't know how we got this far. We did. And we shall start the reading. I just want you to know that my mouth is very dry at the moment, and I will probably be taking quite a few drinking rests like right now. Because because losing my voice already. Because we what because I got distracted today by editing stream that I did last and by making pizza. Uh, I didn't drink much today. That's why. Here we go. Finally heading off to the time reading. Chapter 50. Paperwork ends at last. We've talked a lot about paperwork so far. The loose prayers that had been stuffed into the drawer so that he could hurriedly sit down without fainting took a lot longer to sort through than he had wanted to. They ended up in a mini version of the prayer organization that he had utilized in the other office's gigantic filing cabinets. Hopefully, he could start working on some of the prayers now that everything was sorted into its assigned place. Finding things would actually be possible now that he wasn't under the constant threat of being buried alive beneath them. As he worked through the thousands of requests, it would leave spots open in the now bulging drawers so that the two collections could be assimilated. Less walking between the sites. Can't read my own work. Less walking between the sites Dax was keeping them in meant that there was also fewer opportunities to accidentally misplace things, and that was always going to be a good thing. Great. It's great that we're like 3 paragraphs into stream. Already can't read my own work. It's a great portent for the future. So I moved my mic so that I wouldn't accidentally keep punching it like I usually do in stream. And now I continue to do so. And I don't know how. Thinking back to what the situation was like when he'd first opened the door to the prayer office, Dax was grateful that he'd spent all this time sorting through it because there would have been no way for him to take any action on the prayers while stressing out about how messy they were. Now he was able to see what belonged to who and get the entire context of what he was being asked to do. Trying to find the bottom of the pile had taken an ungodly amount of time to achieve. El Galdi had even at one point offered to lend him the help of some of his own administrative staff to make things easier for him. Dax had turned him down on that offer, determined to get through it on his own, though in the last few days he almost caved in. The initial joy of actually being able to do something about the problem for Dethos turned into a desperate need to finally have it all be over and done with. There was a certain responsibility and care that he owed to the prayers of believers who had continued their faith despite Dethos' inability to answer them. Prayers in the prayer office were something intensely personal to the former owner of the body. Not handling not handling them himself seemed like it would be an insult to both Dethos and his believers, a betrayal of their faith in some way. After completing this mammoth task, Dax took several days off. He was still doing things around the palace, moving small pieces of furniture and cleaning the easy-to-reach surfaces as best he could with what was available to him. The wheelchair and the walking frame that El Galdi had found time to put together for him were really making a world of difference. The walker even had a little chair built into it so that he could sit if he needed to. It was sort of amazing to zip around the place under his own power without someone breathing down his neck. Sure, El Galdia often accompanied him on walks in the gardens and helped him move things that he just couldn't move himself, that he didn't have the strength to move yet, but it always felt like they were working together to complete the task. When Ulrich had been the one watching over him, it had felt more like he was undergoing some sort of test that wasn't being explained. They left him on the floor before, when he had fallen and hadn't helped him up. The heavenly realm really needs a life alone. There had been a day when Dax was trying to move a chaise longue and had reached too far forward and tipped the wheelchair over with himself in it. Elgaldi had been quick to come to his aid and flip the thing back over and hold it whilst the fiercely independent Dax hauled himself back into it. It hadn't made him feel lesser than or self-conscious that his body wasn't working the way that everyone else's was. It had just been a thing that had happened. Elgaldi had dropped the basket containing his food one morning, and the apples contained in it had rolled all over the place. Looking back on the event, it had been very funny to see the look of horror on the tall god's face as he held this tiny little wicker basket with a gingham cloth, chasing red apples as they continuously rolled away from him. Despite having to navigate some of the gravel in the wheelchair, it had been faster for Dax to gather them all back up in the end. Moving the furniture made it so that he could get around the rooms he had traversed through so far, comma, I need to put a comma in there, easier when he was using either of the mobility aids that he was currently using. Getting around was so much nicer when you didn't have to worry about banging into wobbly tables with delicate vases perched precariously upon them. He was doing everything he could to avoid his life becoming a badly written sitcom where some unsuspecting character dropped a priceless Ming vase. Despite constantly turning down entirely new corridors and finding more rooms of unknown use or location, the cleaning was slowly helping him to navigate the building. Now, when Dax found himself somewhere, not knowing where he was, he knew to walk towards whatever direction seemed cleaner. He might still be getting lost in this place for years to come, though. He might still be getting lost in this place for years to come, though, as he had yet to even find the staircase to go upstairs, and this place definitely had more than one floor. A cellar or basement wouldn't be something that he would be shocked to find either, considering the size of the place. Surely there would be a kitchen if Dethos had prized bread so highly. He hadn't seen hide nor hair of that either. When it came time for him to change the covers on his bedding, it took a lot more energy out of him than Dax had really planned for it to do. Why did Dethos have to have such a big bed? It seemed entirely too large right now as he wrestled with the bed covers and lifted the mattress to tuck in the bottom sheet at the corners. Dax's arms were aching by the time he had wrestled the duvet into its new cover, and he was starting to sweat. A soft and calming baby blue colour was what he had chosen from the clean set stored in an armoire by the wardrobe, covers that he collapsed onto for a nap immediately after finishing putting them on. Right now he was in one of the palace gardens that wrapped around the building, admiring the camellias that were blooming there in their many vibrant colours that were everywhere. Almost every inch of the gardens was covered in blooming camellia bushes. Dethos must have really loved the flower. Here and there stalks of wheat and wild meadow flowers peeked their way through the formerly planted beds, with their cheeky sense of defiance over being told they weren't supposed to be growing here, but they added charm to a place that might have felt overly formal. The memory of Dethos's death still came to him unbidden every now and then, mostly when he was resting, the scenes playing behind his tired eyes. How desperate Dethos had been to get El Galdi to recognize him there on that battlefield gave him goosebumps even under the warm rays of the sun. The boy with camellia petals in his hair. Taking a rest from the tasks that had a hand he had at hand made him see just how big of a project he had unknowingly taken on. How long it was going to take just to get through one of the prayers was unknown. The only prayers he had managed to complete until now were the desperate, please don't die ones, and he had done that purely by existing, something that hadn't really taken any effort on his part, although it had initially been very painful. The mountain he was left with was going to be a lot more complicated to deal with because he was going to have to actually do work he had no idea how to do. His magical god powers were still weak, and all that he could do at will, all that he, all that he could do at will was make a small amount of wheat grow, despite his repeated attempts to recreate any of the flashier magic he had done by accident. Maybe he, maybe he could go wherever Dethos was needed and find a way to trigger a panic attack, then hope that whatever happened would be useful. Because so far, the only time he's been able to do magic is magic or use, godlike power is when he's had to, he's felt in physical danger. Completing the main story quest of the prayers was going to have to take priority over figuring out his powers, though, as it was nowhere near complete. It was one thing to move papers out of a room, another to sort them and place them in a neat organizing system, but the biggest task of all was going to be attempting to fulfill them. That part of the task right now felt insurmountable. There were so many that there were so many. He was paralyzed thinking of where he should start. How did you prioritize work when everything had the same amount of urgency behind it? System? How am I supposed to deal with this? Dax asked, his somewhat annoying and recently noticeably absent AI friend. Fulfill them, System replied, cheekily bobbing from side to side as it cycled, the colour of its illuminated orb through the colours of the rainbow. It was hardly even masking its joy at his pain right now. Yes, but how am I actually meant to do that? He was beginning to regret asking it in the first place. Having a conversation with an overly sarcastic and cantankerous AI was exhausting, and right now he just wanted some actual good advice. I don't know. It's up to you, was the very helpful reply he received to his inquiry. You're so helpful, Dax huffed, pulling a flower none too delicately from the nearest flowering bush and stroking the petals. He pulled it apart in his hands, one petal at a time, throwing them onto the floor to rest with the other fallen petals that covered the pathway. I should have brought the broom with me, he thought to himself. Brushing up the fallen petals from the paths would have been a good outlet for his frustration. What he had managed to clear the day El Galdi moved in was barely even 1% of what needed to be done. The god of war has been helping you a lot lately. The system sounded jealous that he had been relying on someone else. What was he meant to do when he asked the system for help and all he received was silence or snarky answers? Just patiently wait for it to explain things for him, or actually go ask someone that was actually willing to help him? Yes, he's yes, he's keeping an eye on me, Dax explained. He'd been annoyed when this arrangement had first started, but he'd been enjoying the time he had been spending with El Galdia. The two of them worked well together, and he didn't try to tell him what to do or act shocked when he ate garlic bread at 4 in the morning. Didn't make a massive deal about his legs. Just made sure that there was options available for him for resting if he needed to. His scars disturbed him, that he could tell, but that trauma was a shared one, and he didn't blame him for it. Whenever Dax caught sight of his new face, the scars that cut across his left cheek and chin were prominently visible and still made him wince. The pain had long ago receded, and he could talk now without the movement threatening to open them anew, but they were definitely not going to fade quickly. El Galdi didn't encroach upon his space, knew when to leave him alone, but was also there when he needed help, or to remind him to take a rest without making it sound like a command presented as a request. He didn't follow him everywhere, asking him only when he was going and only where he was going, and then letting him go there, asking if he wanted food and collecting it for him when he was too tired to make the journey himself. Once the god of war even brought Dax back garlic bread that had spicy cheese dip with him when he'd gone down to the mortal realm on a work trip. He'd even taken him on trips into the city and introduced him to people and places he had apparently been familiar with before. The god was helping him get a grip on the life that Dethos had left behind. One day at a time. He'd even taken him to a beautiful clothes store just down in the lower city when he'd noticed that he was basically re-wearing the same 3 outfits. Oh, I just lost where I was. 3 outfits. No, 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 no. So many of Dethos's clothes were still too big for him, and what wasn't, he couldn't get into without help. He was too embarrassed to ask for. Add to that the fact that he still hadn't found anywhere in this huge building where he could wash his body, never mind his clothes. El Galdi had helped him carry some of the outfits from the wardrobe that were uncomfortably big, or Elgardi had helped him carry some of the outfits from the wardrobe that were uncomfortably big or complicated to wear with him to the tailor's so that they could ask them to be altered to be more accessible. Now he had so many choices to clothe from, choices to cho- clothes to choose from. You don't hate it though. Oh, this is oh, we're doing well. Brain melting. And I should probably take a drink. You don't hate it though. The relationship points between you have been accumulating at breakneck speed, System informed him, showing just how many points he had right now in a gaudy pink text box. We were friends once before, well, everything, Dax replied. He could feel that even though the relationship was strained by the trauma of the past, the hurt would scar, and they'd grow closer together once more. The mutual respect and enjoyment of one another's company was still there. Neither of them were the same person they had been then, quite literally for Dethos and Dax, but every day they smiled at one another and pulled the broken parts of their friendship closer, moulding it back together. One day, it would be fired anew. Mini theatre. Reader. So are we done talking about prayer paper organisation now? Author. I think so. Reader. God, it's very boring. Author. Crying. Yes. Pain. Sometimes you have to sort out your paperwork filing system, and it takes a while. Evan, it's still very analog. Truly. Like, imagine. Imagine. Just like every prayer that you ever give to a god is sent to them as a paper. Like, it's a piece of paper. And they have to deal with that. Even if they're not a particularly popular god. Gotta deal with that. That's the thing. I'm totally not reopening the thing that I was reading from because I accidentally closed it. Shh, I would never do such a thing. I would never do such a thing. Let me see. Where are we? We have just finished chapter 50. Chapter 51. After his little stroll in the garden and shredding many more flowers in his frustration with the system, Dax came to the conclusion that he needed to make a friend. Someone that wasn't a sarcastic AI, one of his guards, or his current flatmate, the god of war. He could also rule out Ulrus, who he hadn't seen in several weeks at this point and actively did not like either. He wondered whether they had been fired when Elgaldi had been ordered to take over the watch on him. Dax didn't dwell on it for too long, as they really hadn't been doing a good job. Hopefully Aurus would get reassigned to a task that was better for them. Operation Make a Friend, commencing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off! Dax laughed at his own thoughts before reflecting on how he was really feeling right now. Things felt constrained. His life was mostly spent in this palace, dealing with the prayers, taking small walks in the garden, eating and sleeping. Sometimes he talked with Elgaldia, and now and then he would take him out into the city to visit interesting places, but he was literally the only person here that he could call a friend. He barely knew anyone here in the heavenly realm at all, and that hadn't been a problem when he had first arrived, because he had just been so glad to actually be able to remain conscious for more than 4 hours at a time. It was, however, beginning to weigh in on his mind more and more as the days passed by. It was nice to be close to El Galdia, but only having one friend felt like a problem. What if he wanted to hang out and the God of War had work that he had to do that left him only able to bother the new guards for a bit, but then he was distracting them from their work, and that was unfair to them. Taking a break from work was nice and all, but now he was bored without anything to do. Well, not having anything to do was a lie. There was the pressing issue of the Deprez to deal with, and he had yet to actually fully explore his palatial home. It was kind of spooky wandering around the empty halls. Everything was mostly clean, so I had the feeling that Dethos had only walked out yesterday, and here he was coming in and disturbing everything to a certain degree. He felt like a squatter in a millionaire's home. It, it was clean, except for the dust, which made the place smell like a second-hand bookstore, or a t-shirt you bought several years ago and then never wore, and it's just been hanging out in the depths of your wardrobe or at the back of a drawer ever since. He was too scared to venture deeper into the labyrinth of rooms in case he got lost and couldn't find his way back out. That truly would be a nightmare. System was still refusing to give him a map of even just the rooms he'd already found on his own, or with Elgaldia determined to make him memorize the layout himself. He was happy to show Dax the mini-map of the city with all the spots he had come across with his new tall friend, now unlocked, but it refused to do the same for his own house. The whole situation was absurd. So he'd taken to drawing a map of his own after borrowing ink from Melgaldia in their shared office. Dethos had dried up. Dethos had all dried up in. What does this mean? Dethos's ink. Okay, that's what I was trying to say. Sometimes you read a sentence, you're like, what was I thinking when I wrote this? So he'd taken to drawing a map of his own after borrowing ink from Elgaldia in their shared office. Dethos's ink had all dried up in the prayer office inkwell. Despite searching through all the drawers in there, he had no idea where there could be any spares. As he explored, he would add onto the map room by room so that he could always be sure of finding his way back, no longer having to rely on his "is this corridor less dusty than that one?" method of finding his way back. It had worked to some degree, but had left Dax getting more and more lost as the cleaning continued. What do gods even do for fun? He asked himself as he walked laps around the outside of the palace, the only sounds being the crunch of gravel between his shoes and the bustle in the surrounding palaces of the goddess of childbirth and the god of grapes. Introducing himself to the neighbours was an option, but with how busy their residences sounded, Jax thought he would be more of a nuisance to them than a welcoming sight. He kicked some gravel. It flew up into the air and rained down further up the path, immediately blending back in again, as if nothing had happened, hiding in plain sight. Dax felt like making a run for it. Not that he couldn't just go and get Elgaldi to take him out, but the lure of being able to come and go as he wished was running pretty strong within him right now. Dax missed being able to just leave the house and come back when he wanted to. Homesickness was starting to bubble up now that he was planning things to do here on a more long-term basis. At first, being here had felt like a weird, painful fever dream. Now it was sinking in that this was going to be where he lived from now on. He'd taken to gathering up all those feelings and memories and just shoving them as deep down inside of himself as he could. Just great coping methods there. Just great coping methods. Taking time to listen to them would just make him feel miserable, and there was no undoing what had happened. He couldn't think about the family that was waiting for him to come home from the internet cafe, his parents eagerly awaiting the results of the university entrance exams he'd just taken, waiting to see waiting to see If they could finally brag about their eldest son to their friends. Sure, he'd taken a while to find his wings after school, but look, he was really making something of himself. We were right to support him through this bumpy period of his life. He couldn't think about them and the life that had been waiting for him there. It was too painful. A tear threatened to escape his eyes. He could feel it wobbling there, ready to spill over the edge of his lashes, and so he widened his eyes as far as he could and viciously tilted his head back to prevent it falling. I will not cry in public. I will not cry in public. I will not cry in public. I refuse to. Dax chanted to himself as he walked between two large bushes for some privacy, and that somehow his water-filled eyes wouldn't overflow between here and there. This whole situation with Elgaldia, Ulrich, and the other guards had made him epic, and thoughts of his previous life just began unwinding from the tight space where he had contained them until now. The thought that he had died there and could no longer go home was slowly eating at him. He thought of home often when he was alone at night, usually just before closing his eyes to sleep, but even in dreams he couldn't go back there. Dax was determined to do his best in his second opportunity of life, but that didn't mean he couldn't mourn the person he was before. The person he was now, somehow, felt like a mixture of his old self and Dethos, a different person entirely, tempered by both people's experiences. How do you even make friends here? He asked the system, but it had gone back to its default state of refusing to talk with him, even though it was still strobing the rainbow. Something it did when particularly amused. Guess it's escaping time then, Dax said to himself after acting so calmly and carefully for so long, in order not or in in order to not get caught out as the imposter he was. It was time to make an impulse decision. One that was probably going to have a bad outcome, but he was going to make it anyway. Feeling a little rebellious. Going out of the front door wasn't going to be an option. There were guards still posted on the other side. They would definitely see him and ask questions. He really didn't want to answer anyone's questions today. He also didn't want to get stopped and turned back like some naughty toddler trying to escape a daycare centre. Leaving via his own front door also wasn't as theatrical as an exit as his whims were wanting today either. And that was how he found himself, attempting to climb over his own wall. He'd taken a while to find a good spot, somewhere covered enough that people wouldn't see him, and far enough away from the spiky plants that he wouldn't impale himself if he fell. He was probably going to fall. This was a lot harder than it looked in games. Dethos's legs were a lot shorter and weaker than his own had been, and that made things a lot more complicated. Despite his worries, he didn't fall from the wall, but that was because he couldn't get up there to begin with. He had managed to get one of his ankles high enough up the wall that he could hook it over the edge and try to shimmy up the rest of the way, but no matter how much he tried, he couldn't get the momentum he needed. Even though the wall was pretty low, Dax didn't have the strength to pull himself up and over with his hands either. So here he was, unable to remove his leg because of cramp, and not enough momentum or but upper body strength to pull himself the rest of the way over the wall. It was quite embarrassing. System was laughing at him as he tried in vain to unhook himself from the wall and the foliage covering it he had used to get his leg that high up there in the first place. It was in this position that the god of war found him not long later, just as he was contemplating getting over his pride and calling out for some help. Dax was thinking about whether just going limp and falling would hurt very much from his position, holding on like a monkey halfway up the wall with nothing but his trapped leg and fingernails preventing him from falling down, when Elgaldia rushed up to him, spraying gravel everywhere. He looked terrified, like he'd seen a ghost or a toddler about to walk into traffic. Dax found himself laughing at the situation so much that he actually did lose his grip on the wall and he fell, swinging from that annoying foot still hooked over the wall, almost smashing his face into the bricks. He was saved by El Galdi, who had managed in his mad dash along the path to get there in time to grab hold of him before he lost his front teeth. If being caught trying to climb over his own wall wasn't embarrassing enough, then falling into his open arms like a young woman in a historical romantic comedy definitely was. Elgaldia softly helped him release his foot before putting him back onto his feet. The gravel shifted beneath him as he fervently stared at the floor, not to meet the other's gaze. Dax could feel his face flushing. It was so warm, he was sure he resembled a beetroot right now. The blush was probably so pronounced that even his ears were red. There were a few moments of embarrassed silence between them before the god of war broke it. You don't have to sneak around, he said, his voice sounding somewhat pained. It's your own house. Mini theatre. How to climb a wall. 101. Teacher. What's the best way to climb a wall? Student. Use the door. Teacher. Yes, preferably you should always check for any conventional method first. What should we do if there is no door? Student. Use the ladder. Teacher. What a great idea. Author. That's right, Dax. What a great idea it is to use a ladder. Dax spits out drink. You did this to me. Unfortunately, I did do this to him. Just thought it was funny. End of chapter 51. We're in chapter 52 right now. That chapter is called I Like This Guy. Dux is struggling to put into words what he wanted to say. There were, of course, curse words that he wanted to say. And I love how, even at this point, I just find points in the story where I'm like, I misspelt this word. And I didn't see it any of the times I read it. And I read it probably at least 8 times at this point. And for some reason, instead of curse words, it said coarse words. As in coarse with an O. Uh, this is everyone is why you need an edit. We'll start from the beginning because we're literally 2 sentences in. Dax was struggling to put into words what he wanted to say. There were, of course, words he wanted to say, and in his there were of course words that he wanted to say, and in his mind he had them all gathered. But no matter what way he had them assembled, it didn't seem to make any sense. You just get like word blindness when you look at something too many times. When you realize actually it was meant to be coarse there, and you just changed it to curse and made an even bigger problem. Can we get past the first paragraph of the story? Can we do that? Can we small pastry bin? A small pastry brain is struggling right now. The longer that it took, the more Dax could feel that he was losing the time in which he could say them. If only he could get it right so that El Galdia could know what he was trying to get across to him. Time seemed to stretch and contract as his panic rose. This silence, it was too long. It's terribly uncomfortably long. He's going to think that I think something that I don't think and get hurt. His brain was telling him. The warning did not fall on deaf ears, but Dax felt powerless to do anything about it. The silence was indeed entirely too long, and there was also not enough time for him to fix that. Before he could catch hold of the words he wanted to say and get them into a sentence that made any kind of sense, El Galdia started to speak again, and the window of time felt like it had shattered. You're not a child, and I'm not your parent. If you want to go out, you're perfectly welcome to do so. Would I prefer that you went with someone till you're confident that you can find your way back? He breathed out through his nose, and although the weather was not cold, the air leaving his nose still misted in front of him. Yes, I would, but I'm not going to stop you. The god of war was standing there with his arms crossed over one another in front of him, but he looked more confused than the anger Dax had half expected to see there. Thank you, Dax said, genuinely moved by his statement. Being respected as an autonomous person was a basic right, but it was nice to see someone willing to uphold it for him, even if they were worried that he might not be making the right choice. His hamstring was cramping in the leg that he had over-enthusiastically attempted to hang all of his weight on from the wall. Bending down to massage some life back into it, Dax took some time to think. Why he hadn't just gone and searched for a ladder, he had no idea. You would think that finding a ladder would have been the first thought Dax had put. First out of stream. You might have thought that finding a ladder would have been the first thought that Dax had, but climbing this wall had been an impulsive thought in the first place. Dax's original body could probably have gone over the wall unaided. He may have been an MMORPG player and lived in his parents' house still, but he was also broke and had to walk everywhere. Sometimes that meant carrying 30 kilos worth of groceries home on your own in the rain for about an hour. Dethos's body was still recovering from the injuries that he had woken up with, and it was also at least 4 inches shorter than his own. Even after being here for so long and thinking that he had finally acclimatized to it, Dax was still overestimating how high he was able to reach. He'd gone from being the person everyone asked to get things down from the top shelf to the person that had to ask for help. It was a strange feeling. Your full memories aren't back yet, so I would be worried about you going out alone and getting lost. But that's for me to deal with. That's my problem, Elgaldia said, pulling a leaf out of the top of the shorter god's hair. It had probably tangled itself between the strands when he had squeezed his way through the tightly packed bushes earlier. Dax had been so determined in his attempt to escape that he hadn't even noticed it until Elgaldia's fingers were expertly fishing them out for him. I like this guy, Dax thought to himself. Sure, he'd probably thought that before, but there comes a time in every interaction where you suddenly realize whether you want to keep on going with it or not, where you realize the vibes the other person is giving off. Until now, he had only really thought of the god of war as a friendly face, Dethos's old friend, and maybe the sort of face you looked forward to seeing at work because you know that they're going to make your shift significantly less shit for you. The sort of person that you would gladly change shifts just to be able to hang out with, who you complained about management to, and who you hid in the walk-in freezer with. I did find a genuine spelling mistake. And who you hid in the walk-in refrigerator with, organizing things that didn't need to be organized to kill time so you didn't have to talk to rude customers. I like this guy, his brain told him again. He's my friend. He'd been really pretty down earlier, and he'd still felt the need to branch out his social relationships. But right now, Dax's heart was feeling just a little fuller, just a little less alone. I know. Look at your. I know. Look at your relationship points, System remarked, breaking its silence at last. A bright pink text box. text box. I don't know why I said it. Appeared in his vision once again. The numbers displayed on it in a garish font, rapidly increasing second to second. Wow, I was so tired. It wasn't like this last week. Dax blinked several times, his eyes watered as the almost neon colour threatened to burn itself into his retina. What are relationships points even for? He asked the AI. It had never explained to him but on the use of the most basic points, the ones he was required to use to purchase skill and quality of life upgrades. Those were seemingly a lot harder to gain than these relationship points that seemed to be rapidly accumulating through no real work on his part. System had only really started saying anything about them once he had already started earning them. Dax sighed, keeping track of all the things that he was supposed to be doing right now felt overwhelming. Just how many currencies did this AI gather? To add to it all, his unlocked download still hadn't finished downloading. He could see the progress bar whenever he looked up, and it mocked him with the sheer slowness with which it filled. Just how shit was the connection that he had now before the increased download speed upgrade was in place? System's main light slowly faded from gold to pink and back again, in what under normal circumstances would be a rather aesthetic choice of colour and fade pattern, but right now it was annoying. Wait and see, it replied in a new, even more smug tone than before. To say that Dax was highly annoyed by System's continuously secretive behaviour was an understatement, but before he had the chance to argue with it, he was interrupted once more. Are you okay? Elgaldia asked, his tone concerned. He'd taken 2 steps forward, closing the distance between them so much that they were almost touching. Dax found his face heating up, and he panicked that the others would notice it. So close were they that they would almost be impossible to not notice that it ended up making his blushing skin even more red. He could swear just from feeling the heat spread that his entire face must be beetroot red by now. You went blank for a little while there. I'm fine. I was just thinking, Dax explained hurriedly, tucking his shirt that had become loose during his fall and subsequently being grabbed to not break his teeth, his neck or his teeth, both of them. Not breaking either of them is good. Not breaking your neck, great for your health. Not breaking your teeth, great for your wallet. Back into trousers he was currently wearing. How was he supposed to explain that he was talking to an invisible floating orb containing an AI that controlled his life and caused him to possess a body of a god after he died from eating beef noodles? There was no way that he could bring that up. There was no way that he could bring up that particular topic and not get quickly escorted wherever they took deities that had gone completely insane. That was only if the system didn't nuke him from existence first, though. Some things were just meant to be kept to yourself. Do you still want to go out? The god of war asked, holding out his hand, palm up in an invitation for Dax to hold it if he wanted to. Without putting much thought into it, Dax put his hand on top of Elgaldia's. Sure. Mini theatre. Elgaldia. We're holding hands. Blushes. Dax. We're holding hands. Blushes harder. Elgaldia. What does this mean? Dax. What does this mean? Author. I feel embarrassed just writing this. Readers. Please save me from these two clueless, immortal beings. End of chapter 52. We got through a whole chapter without stream falling off the face of the earth. And isn't that grand? Isn't that grand and amazing and grand? And grand. How am I finger? And now we move on to chapter 53, which has a very long title. If it ever opens, here we are. Chapter 53, Bath Bombs, Sun Catchers, and Running Away. Turning the corner to see Dethos hanging off of a wall, suspended only by one of his feet, whilst he tried to catch it like a tried to climb it like a spider, and failing was particularly anxiety provoking for Elgaldia. He was trying to fulfill Umdum's wishes that he watch over the weak god without watching him in an overbearing hawk-like manner. Having him fall off a wall and hurting himself when he was technically under his care was probably something that would get him replaced with Ulrich again. Knowing the Emperor? Probably. I feel like Dax would think of fist fight with Ulrich if they tried to turn up in his life again. Uh, from the emotional state Tethos had been in when Ulrich had been in charge of that duty, Elgaldia didn't think that would go over particularly well. He'd definitely put up a fight, and the stress wouldn't be good for his recovery. Omdom had already pointed out that very clearly to Elgaldia. Do, 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 do. Actually, falling off of the wall wouldn't really have done any physical damage to him, now that all of his wounds were sufficiently scabbed over. A few weeks ago, just tripping over could have caused him to have catastrophic blood loss again, and that was something he could never live with that was something he could never live with having happened on his watch. It would have hurt, especially when his mouth smashed off of the wall, but the teeth would have grown back. Gods could usually tank a lot of damage before any actual wound occurred. It was one of the benefits of the job. It also meant that there wasn't much in the way of improvements in dental science up here. Seeing someone that you cared about fall off a wall didn't change how you felt about it, even if you knew that, though. It was an instinctual response. It would have happened even if there was a 15-meter deep foam pit underneath Dethos, and he was inside one of those inflatable balls just the same. The last part he had sprinted The last time he had sprinted so fast was across a battlefield somewhere in Endspar or Endshub or Endshub. It was getting hard to keep track of the nations that rose and fell endlessly in the mortal realm. Sometimes they just randomly decided to change their names. Luckily, it caught him in time to prevent Dethos having to grow out those new teeth. For some reason, he'd expected him to be heavier. Perhaps in the past he had been. That part of his memory seemed fuzzy now that he tried to access it. Despite the time that had passed and the scars Dethos had gained, so much of him was unchanged. Sure, he had put on some weight since the day he'd awoken in the lake, but he was not yet back to the body shape Elgaldi remembered. I got jump scared by the ice in my drink, uh, making a noise. It just fell over and it was like, I don't know if you can hear it, but like, I have like a bottle that was fully frozen. And like this, it's got like a big iceberg in the middle of it right now, and it like moves around, and it just, it just made a really loud noise. I was like, what is that? Teeth. We talked about teeth. Despite the time that had passed and the scars Dethos had gained, so much of him was unchanged. So he'd put on some weight since the day he'd awoken in the lake, but he was not yet back to the body shape Elgaldia remembered. He'd had to take him to get his clothes altered so that they would fit because of that. Logically, he knew that the clothes he'd been wearing had worn him more than the other way around before that. Dethos had been all but swimming in them. The bagginess made him look younger and frailer than he was, like a child wearing his father's clothes. They'd greatly emphasized the weight loss and had probably provoked everyone's feelings of overprotectiveness. The newly taken in and tailored clothes fitted a lot better. His arms, though, his arms had remembered how he had fit in them before. Elgaldia shook, shook. I'll get there eventually. Elgaldia shook such thoughts. Who would have thought that that was a tongue twister? Out of his mind. Quickly placing Dethos on his own feet again. Dethos's face resembled a strawberry. He was blushing so deeply that even his ears had to be burning. It made Elgaldia's curse. Elgaldia curse himself for how much he had liked holding him. It had made the smaller god feel uncomfortable. He hadn't expected Dethos to take the hand he had extended to him. Instead, he had thought that the other was, it's not others, it's other, melting my own brain. He hadn't expected Dethos to take the hand he had extended to him. Instead, he had thought that the other would link arms with him again, as they had done many times on the trips he had taken him on, showing him the sights of the heavenly city. When they linked arms, Dethos could lean on him when he needed to, and it meant that he could walk without the walking frame for a little longer. Instead of linking arms, he grabbed his hand, and now they were walking side to side, or side by side. Both those things are applicable. I'm just writing a note. Do 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 do. Holding hands. The sun was setting, filling the sky with vivid, really, 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 really struggling to speak right now. The sun was setting, filling the sky with a vivid orange light. There were no clouds to obscure it. At least we have returned. I don't know what happened. I randomly disconnected and then it connected to a different thing than it needed to, but we exist now. I will return. Go back a little bit because I don't know what disappeared. Do, 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 do. He felt like he could breathe, looking into that smiling face and feeling the warmth of his hand within his own again. All the years that had passed between them until they were here together again seemed like they had only been a bad dream. When he had been chained up after the battle was finally won and the other deities of heaven had managed to capture him, it had taken a long time to become aware of what had happened. The poison running through his veins left him filled with a rage so deep and overwhelming that it had drawn a red mist over his eyes. He hadn't known anything other than the things the red mist let him for what felt like an age of the earth. Eventually it had worn off, but they had to chain him, placing many seals of binding over his body so that he could not act upon his altered feelings for hundreds of years. When he had begun to regain his own mind, then he was left with the consequences of his inability to fight it off. Once he knew what he had done, Ilgaldi had begged for them to poison him again with the Demon Emperor's blade, over and over again. Being lost in the rage was better than the grief that had welled up to take its place. He'd even begged the Emperor to throw him down the staircase that led to the mortal realm, so he could walk among them as a human once more. Venus had declined his request. Living to see the day he was living right now seemed like a cruel dream, no matter how many times the deities of death had snuck into his chambers and whispered that they were trying to save Dethos. That he just had to wait, that things would turn out all right. That he had to live long enough to ask for the absolution he didn't think that he deserved. Before they slipped back home into the halls, they patrolled in the underworld as quietly as they had come. In the years since, Ilgaldi had forgotten much of what they had told him, but he had never forgotten the hope that they had reignited in his heart when all he had wanted to do was fade away. Another god returned to dust. The sunset's light caught the silver hairpin Dethos was using to keep his hair out of his eyes, and its sparkle pulled him back out of the memory. The weak god squeezed his hand and looked at him in concern. His mind must have wandered for some time. Lagaldia squeezed back, careful to control the strength he was using to not hurt him. He could feel the bond between them healing tangibly now, and he didn't know whether he could dare to dream that they could stand together as they had done the same way again. No one saw them as they rounded yet another corner in the garden, hand in hand. Before them stood the secret entrance to the palace Dethos had once shown him, the very same one by which he had recently made his way in. It was equally as hidden by the foliage here as it was on the other side of the door. Elgaldia let go of Dethos's hand in order to push aside the hanging vines behind which the door lay so that he could open it. Leaving go of the warmth the other god's hand gave him made him a little unsure about what he was about to do. This is a way out only you and I know of, he said, turning back to look at Dethos, who was still standing where he had left him. It was hard to tell if his face was still flushed or whether the last rays of light peeking over the horizon were dyeing it so. You can use it whenever you want to go somewhere without being asked what you're doing. Hurry through, I'll hold it open for you, it's quite heavy. He pulled the door open for the smaller god. It was a lot harder to open from this side than it was from the outside. The weight of the vines was hard to hold open and swing the door at the same time. You only had to push from the other side. There would have there would have to be some improvements made if Dethos wanted to leave this way and he was in his wheelchair, but that would have to wait till later. He'd pulled the door open, but Dethos was still standing there looking at him. Come with me, the weak god whispered. It was barely loud enough to hear. There had to there had to be butterflies out there that made more noise than this proposal had. What? Elgaldia asked, trying to make sure what he had heard was not a mistake his brain had made from all the wishing he'd been doing today. Dethos didn't repeat what he had said, fidgeting as if trying to decide whether to do something or not before stepping forwards. His lower lip clamped between his teeth in determination as he reached out and grabbed Elgaldia's hand, pulling him through the door with him. Elgaldia found himself being pulled after the enthusiastic god of wheat by his hand through the secret door and the vines on the outer side of the darkness of the alley that lay beyond, the same way they had thousands of times before. Dethos was bringing with him. Dethos was bringing him with him, and he was happy to go wherever he was taken. He was hyper aware of the way the skin of their hands was touching, the sweatiness of his palm, and the smile on Dethos's face. It felt like a dream. They sneaked their way out of the upper city as quietly as they could. Yeah. As quietly as they could, hoping to make the guards none the wiser that they had left at all. Not that the weak god needed permission to leave his own home anymore. Elgardia replaced all the guards with people he trusted from the War Department as soon as he could. They knew that they were there to support Dethos and not cage him. Dethos pulled him down dark paths devoid of people, and what had started as a sedate stroll slowly devolved into giggles of laughter as they ran through the parks and gardens of the middle city, jumping over puddles and being chased by birds. The bench overlooking the lights of the lower city came in handy when Dethos started wheezing his short burst of energy, leaving him as suddenly as it had come. As the stars shone down on them from the blue black of the night sky, they both sat there as they caught their breath again. Being with Dethos was never boring. Are you okay? He asked as Dethos pulled out a handkerchief to wipe the sweat from his face. A wheezed out affirmative was his response. It was only then that he noticed that they were still holding hands. Both their palms were sweating now, and the damp feeling was uncomfortable, but Elgaldi didn't want to be the first person to let go. Sorry. Dethos didn't seem to want to either. So they sat there, watching the rainbow of lights that made up the lower city, where the streets never slept, until Dethos was able to breathe normally again. When he was able to breathe again, they headed slowly down into the lower city, taking the less busy streets, sitting on low walls and bollards when Dethos needed a break. Elgaldia made a note to pack a comfortable folding chair or carrying a spare wheelchair in the dimensional ring he always wore for future trips, kicking himself for not thinking about it earlier. Some context to that. I once, when I was, sorry, my elbow's really itchy. When I was in university, I was in a different city, and I had to go to an appointment at a hospital where I'd never been before, and I was so stressed about it and so mentally ill at the time that figuring out the bus route to get there was just not what I was about at all, and it was like I would have had to take three different buses to get there, and it would have took like 2 hours because one of the buses you had to take was going in like the opposite direction than what you needed. I had to take like a bus into the inner city and then take a bus from there to somewhere else and then a bus from there to the hospital and then still walk for like 20 minutes, I think. So what I decided to do was to just walk there. And you're like, Raven, surely that's like a sensible distance to do. No, that wasn't. It wasn't, and I was like, I'm like, that was the year where like I couldn't walk upstairs because my kneecaps would dislocate. uh, Even though I was in like generally better health then, but like yeah, my knees would dislocate if I went upstairs, and I had to. I went. I did two trial runs before the day that I had to go there. Where like I I'd saved the Google map and I was using it to like navigate my way there. Um, the first time I was like, okay, can I actually get there from walking this? Like, is this an insane thing that I'm doing right now? It was. But I did make it there, and then I walked back. But on the way back, my legs started giving out on me, and like it was like a residential area that we were walking through. So there's no benches to sit on, and I think it was winter, so like I couldn't sit on the floor because it was wet or snowy. So a lot of people had like low walls outside of their houses. So I like would sit on the sit on the garden wall as I was making my way back home. Otherwise, I really would have just been absolutely miserable. Because you know when you're like you estimate like you see how far away a place is, then you forget you also have to come back. That's what I did. I did it the first time. I'm like, can I actually get this? And the second time was like, if my phone goes flat or I somehow accidentally manage to delete the map, will I be able to get back without being lost forever in the sea? It was like I wrote down like places I had to see, like to know that I was going in the right way. Like, oh, we go past this park and then we go through this bit and then we go around here and then there's stairs and then there's this building and then there's this shop. It was truly a time in which I did many things and not all of them were sensible. But hey, I had to go to the appointment and I just couldn't do the bus journey. But I was like, thank you to everyone who has a wall on their garden. Thank you to all the bollards that are exactly the right height to sit on. And that's how I made it home. Well, I made it to my flat. I was like, God, I, I'm home. And I think I laid on the floor for like 4 hours in my room because it's just like I couldn't stand up anymore. I really paid for it the next day. I think I had to not go to class because it was like I can't stand up. Anyway, enough about my questionable choices. A huge smile still painted Dethos's face, and he pointed out whatever caught his eye as they walked. A mural of a dog wearing a deer stalker and smoking a pipe. I don't know why I said smoking. Smoking a pipe on the side of a block of flats. The bird-shaped lanterns hanging outside of a bird-themed cafe, and the flowering cacti someone had planted in a series of old Wellington boots, to name but a few. The Guardian was glad he liked it down here as much as he did. There was always something going on in the lower city, no matter the day or time. Something he looked something he often took advantage of on nights when he wanted to be alone but around other people. Meeting with friends or work colleagues meant planning things so that everyone could attend several days, if not weeks, in advance, and he would be expected to talk. Talking was something he hadn't wanted to do a lot of back when he had first been released from his chained imprisonment. There were days when it was just too difficult to do. Just being around other people helped him to stay in the present, reminded him that he was alive, and the lower city itself was filled with memories he had with Ethos. Their directionless wandering had taken them away from the nightclub district and over to the night market. It was still early, so hardly any of the stalls were set up yet. They took another seat on the side of a large planter filled with sunflowers and watched the other deities rushing around, pulling out folding tables from carts and arranging their wares upon them. If you wanted something in the heavenly realm, this was the place that you went. You needed a super rare magical plant for something? Night market. A book? Night market. Jewelry? Clothing? Misc items from the mortal realm? Food? A cool weapon? Etc. Night market. There was even a rising trade in toiletries and cosmetics made by the deities involved in the beauty and science fields. The goddess of bath bombs waved at them from her stall that was bending in the middle, so many things were piled upon it. She was covered in glitter and wearing gloves as she ensured that all the bath bombs were the right way up. That's Jan, Elgaldia said. Dethos raised an eyebrow at the name. Jan was a very normal name when it came to the deities of the heavenly realm. No one could forget the existence of Rebootium, Lord of backed up hard drives, after all. She wanted to be called C5H7O5 CO2H aqueous plus NaHCO3 aqueous turns into C5H7O5 CO2 Na plus aqueous plus H2O liquid plus CO2 gas. But that's a heck of a mouthful, so we just call her Jan. For reference, that's the chemical makeup of the reaction that happens in bath bombs when you put them in water. What do people pray to her for? Dethos asked as he happily swung his legs. That the bath bomb they're making will stick together and not crumble into sand, or that the one they're using with dubiously bright colour doesn't stain the bathtub or their skin. Seems like she's very important, then, the weak god was smiling, no doubt imagining people dyed various colours after invoking her wrath. Dethos and he walked up and down between the stalls, looking at the wares people had out on display. Elgaldia laughed, seeing Dethos trying on an especially ugly red velvet hat covered in edible stuffed peppers, and he caught himself wondering when the last time he had laughed this hard was. It was the sort of laugh where you started to lose the ability to breathe properly. He felt happy. Dethos grabbed his hand again and pulled him along to a large stall showcasing glassware. Each piece was sparkling in the dim light of the candle-filled lanterns. They looked no different than if they had been made of pure diamond, cut, polished, and shined to perfection. I forgot where I put. The glittering glass came in various goods in a plethora of shapes and sizes, but there were some very precious and pretty sun catchers on display. He saw Dethos looking at a particular one. It was an arrangement of camellia flowers surrounded by butterflies. Beneath it, various groups of shiny crystal shapes hung, every facet cut into it, delicate and highly intricate, a true work of art. From some master craftsman. It would look beautiful hung in one of the rooms in the palace, would really help give it a lived-in feeling. Elgaldir asked Dethos if he wanted to buy it and made to get his own purse from an inner pocket. Dethos hurriedly shoved the purse back into his pocket and stammered, "Oh no, you don't have to buy it. I was just looking." Then he hurried out of the valley. We're not in a valley, we're in an alley. Into a larger street on the other side. In the midst of the wheat god's panicked fleeing, Elgaldir made a quick purchase before rushing to catch up with him. Luckily, he hadn't actually gone very far. He was still scared of being separated from his companion and not being able to find his way home, which had worked to Elgaldir's favour just now. When he found Dethos again, he was talking to a goddess covered from head to toe in clean white bandages. They were slowly walking down the street together, Dethos holding a bag of nectarines filled almost to capacity, and she was slowly shuffling along beside him, her movements restricted by the tautness of the fabric wrapped around her. The pair turned a corner before Elgaldi could catch up with them. He didn't want to run after him in case it drew more attention to them than they were currently enjoying, and he didn't want to alarm anyone, so he speed walked his way after them. By the time he too rounded the corner, there was only Dethos standing by a letterbox without either the bandaged lady or the bag of fruit. "You're really fast when you're embarrassed," Elgaldia said, and handed him the paper bag with the previously admired suncatcher in it. "That was Bix Dite, a goddess from the healing office," Dethos said, gesturing what Elgaldia supposed was the direction she had walked off into. She dropped the nectarines and couldn't pick them back up because of the bandages. His hands tightly held the bag, as if something incredibly precious was in it, after he opened it to see what was inside. When Dethos looked back up at him, Elgaldia found the corner of his own mouth lifting at the flustered look on the other's face. Was he embarrassed that he had brought him the suncatcher? It wasn't expensive, the god of war explained, ensuring that he had a good hold of the bag it was in. Plus, my presence in your home is a massive inconvenience to you. He'd been worrying lately whether he'd brought too many things when he moved in, that Dethos probably had ideas for the room they were currently using as a joint office, and he was taking up about 80% of the space. Elgaldi had tried to bring only what was absolutely necessary for him to still be able to do his job as the god of war, but that had unfortunately still been a lot of things. "I don't mind. It's actually spooky to be in there alone, especially at night," the smaller god said, as he firmly folded the opening of the bag and placed it in an inner pocket, securely located behind a buttoned opening so that it could not fall out. Lugaldi was starting to notice that people who previously hadn't given a fuck who they were or why they were there had started staring at them and whispering to each other. "Oh my god, who's he with?" he heard an excited voice say somewhere behind them. Remembering what had happened last time, Elgaldia was in a hurry to move on, but Dethys had already grabbed his hand and started running. Elgaldia had to run quite fast to keep up with him. He marvelled at the other's speed and endurance, knowing that he would no doubt be paying for this tomorrow with a cramp, pain, and reduced movement. Shops and cafes passed by them, only as different coloured flashes of light, as they ran together up the road, past people they very barely missed slamming into. "Was that the god of war and the god of wheat?" someone asked loudly as they passed. "Didn't he kill him? Why are they holding hands? Why are they running?" Oh, my toe. I just clicked. I don't know if you heard it, but it was very loud. Ow. There we go again. I love how my phone just decided to tell me I had a mixed call from 1 p.m. Only 7 hours too late. Uh, Dethos's flailing free arm accidentally bumped into a lady wearing a very sparkly pink dress and who was covered in heavy looking golden jewellery as they ran. Sorry, he hastily shouted, not stopping to hear her angry shouts as soon as he assured himself that she was still on her feet and unharmed. Elgaldia did look back as he passed by to see her severely pissed off looking expression and the jangling of her jewellery as she held up her arm in an obscene gesture. It didn't matter though, as they were soon gone from sight around yet another street corner. Mini theatre. Jan, try my new rose bath bombs. Dax, they look really pretty. Elgaldia, give me them all, please. Jan, all of them? Deities in the upper city really did live different lives. Elgaldia, yes. What Dethos wants, Dethos gets. Dax, I only want one. I only have one body to bathe, and I don't even need to do it for hygiene reasons. Jan, they're shaped and scented like a rose, and in the centre are some dried rose petals. Dax, that's a really cool idea. I bet they look really pretty when the petals start being released from it. Elgaldia, take my money. Take my money. Take my money. Dax, I don't even know where my bath is. True. He hasn't found where the bath in the palace is yet. So he's like, should I just shower? Should I just wash my clothes and wash myself in a fountain? Wouldn't that be easier? And that was the end of chapter 53. Chapter 54, Closer Than Imagined. They ran and ran through narrow alleys that widened ever more and more as they ascended heaven's largest city. The streets were darker, fewer and fewer windows with lights still burning in them, fewer street lamps, and fewer city residents to see them. Algaldia marvelled at the speed and endurance Dethos was pulling from somewhere unknown in order to keep going. He tried to reduce his own pace in an effort to get the weak god to slow his anxious flight, but that had only resulted in the grip Dethos had on his hand increasing as he began dragging him along behind. Like a child, he followed along, despite possessing more than enough strength to break the smaller god's grip. He really could have broken the grip on him. At any point, Dethos's fingers were long and thin. Though often used for kneading bread, they had nothing on his own, used to wielding a sword. Elgaldi was worried if he did break that hold, he would lose the god of wheat in the crowd. Dethos was already scared, adding his fear of crowds to that. There was no knowing how he would react if they were to become separated. Last time, in his fear, he had discharged enough energy to make himself really weak again, and the god of war was scared that this time it would be big enough and uncontrolled enough that it would do more than just make him tired. There were still small patches of wheat growing in his administrative office, after all. Worried that Dethos could faint or trip pulling him like this, Elgaldia soon returned to matching the fleeing god's hurried steps. Streets flashed by and people scattered before them like seagulls on a beach. The god of war wondered if Dethos even knew where he was running to, or if he was just running away. Did he even know what it was that he was running from? The questioning eyes of the other deities had long been left behind. In the state that Dethos was currently in, Elgaldia had no idea how long it was going to take to calm him down enough to stop running. That they were leaving the lower sea was only something he noticed when the gates began looming before them, and Dethos had to slow down because of the press of the crowd. He tried calling out to him, but he did not seem to hear any more, or at least Dethos was unable to respond. Eventually, the seemingly endless running ended when Dethos flopped down on the same bench that they had been sitting on earlier tonight. The view was just as beautiful as it had been, but Elgaldi couldn't let himself get distracted by it, as the other god almost fell off of the bench he was shaking so heavily. He rushed round and grabbed him by the shoulders. sitting him back upright and holding him there as he gasped for breath. As he held him, there was nothing but the sound of their breaths to break the silence. There was no use asking the smaller god anything right now. He could barely breathe. It sounded so loud in the quiet stillness of the middle city. The park itself was silent except for the sound of a swan swimming past them in the pond several meters behind them. Water lapped the bank, and the swish of its wings were a welcome distraction as they waited. Finally, when it felt safe to let go of Dethos, Elgalde rushed round to the front of the bench to sit beside him, but felt something in his back pocket he hadn't remembered being there before. He fished it out, annoyed that it was taking time to do so. For some reason, the pocket was too tight for him to squeeze his fingers in around the object, only to find the glass suncatcher he had bought earlier in there. He could have sworn that he had given it to Dethos to carry in its paper bag, and that he had put it in one of his own pockets. There didn't seem to be any damage to it, and as he looked at it in the dim light, Dethos's eyes followed his gaze to see what it was he was holding, and he passed it over to him to look at. He began laughing. Not a, oh, this is amazing, this is amusing, how did it get there kind of laugh, but a hysterical laugh that you had when you were having a bad time and something vaguely weird happens. The sort of laugh you gave off because you didn't want to cry. You wanted everyone to be distracted from the fact that something bad had happened and you desperately didn't want to talk about it. Elgato took the hint not to ask about what had just happened, at least until Dethos brought it up. He was still looking at the suncatcher in his hands, gently spinning it, seeing the small flashes of light that it reflected from its surface in the light of a distant lamp. The god of war was pleasantly surprised that the chain from which everything hung had not become tangled by whatever had caused it to change person as they ran. It had multiple strings with multiple crystals hanging from it. How they weren't resembling a bowl of noodles right now was a mystery. He definitely wouldn't have been able to untangle it. His mind was taken back to the tassel he used to decorate the pommel of his sword, and how it had spent more time a matted, tangled mess than it had aesthetically hanging by his side. He'd lost it somewhere. Actually, he wouldn't put it past Nightwares to have thrown it out when he wasn't looking. The man had always hated it. Dethos was still laughing as he returned the dream catcher somewhat clumsily to the pocket Elgaldia swore he had seen him put it in before. How did that even happen? Dethos asked, laughing, swinging his legs back and forth beneath the park bench playfully. If his body language before had been saying, "Don't ask me what just happened," right now it was screaming at the top of its lungs. "I don't know," Elgaldia said, trying to engage with him on the topic he had fixed on as being safe. Other things could wait till later. He didn't need that answers in a rush, and rushing Dethos right now wouldn't get him anywhere. "Do you remember the dog painting with the hat the week God asked? That was so funny. A spaniel in a pillbox hat painted on the side of a hair salon in a street they had long ago left behind them. It was amusing. There are more funny dog paintings, if you would like to go see them sometime. Someone had really spent a lot of time making them, but there were an increasing number of cats wearing bows appearing on the sides of buildings in the lower city." Dethos nodded, pushing back the hair that had come loose from the hairpin he usually used to hold it out of his eyes. He groped around trying to find the pin, laughing again when he found that it had migrated its way around his head and was now halfway down the length of his hair. After repinning it, he looked up at the moon, now high above them. It may have been observed, partially obscured by clouds, but it was full and round. Light from the distant lamp and the rays from the moon gave them enough to make out one another's expressions. Enough light to see that the large, brightly coloured moth that decided to land on his nose. Dethos froze, unable to move, not even to breathe as it sat there, not wanting to hurt it by accident. He daren't do anything to move it away from his face. Elgaldia reached out with his forefinger outstretched to gently brush it from the gentle curve of the weak god's nose. It wasn't stubborn about keeping its sitting spot, and the moth languidly flapped away to find something more suitable, once prodded gently a few times. That left the god of war with his hand touching Dethos's face. Now that he was free to move and breathe normally again, the weak god lowered his head from gazing upon the moon and locked eyes. I might not remember when we, I might not remember when we were swan brothers, Dethos said, saying once again in a gentle whisper of a voice that made you strain your ears to hear it and doubt the content of every sentence you thought you heard. Lagaldi had to use everything in his power to stop himself from choking on his own breath at the swan brothers. But that doesn't mean that we can't be friends right now, right? There was something desperate in his voice, as if he was trying to grab hold of something that was slowly slipping away from him. The god of war might have been able to stop himself from choking before, but he couldn't stop the pained expression that flitted across his face. He wasn't sure whether or not the other picked it up before he managed to control himself again, a smile now firmly fixed on his face. Now that he'd finally found the path to redemption he'd been so desperate to walk upon for so long, it was folly to be hurt by the memories of the past. Swan, brothers, a holly bush on their left, where she'd gone by completely ignored, suddenly rustled before something jumped out at them. Ugalde threw himself in front of Dethos out of a well-honed instinct and duty. A light mocking voice greeted them, and a jangle of many bracelets. Swan Brothers is a very weird way of saying married. Mini theatre. Deity. Does the god of war usually sprint through the lower city holding hands with the god of wheat? Goddess. That was the god of wheat. I've never seen him before. God. Yeah, he looks just like the statue, just thinner. Deity. I wonder why they were running. Goddess. IDK. I don't know. Why do people usually run holding hands? Deity. Ooh, are they dating? This is hot goss. Heaven's most eligible bachelor is dating the totally not actually dead god of wheat. Social media would love that. Friends to lovers to enemies to strangers to friends to lovers. Hopefully not back to enemies again. God, you better not post that. People will laugh at you. Goddess, why? Because the god of war is single since birth. God, that's his like actual husband. Goddess and deity. What? Arthur. Yes, yes, I just did that to you, and yes, I am proud of myself. Thank you very much. That's in the back. That's in the back for me. Also, can these lads have one nice day trip, please? And thank you. That was chapter 54. I am going to have a drink. And now, 55. This chapter is chapter 55, and it is called, and the historians will say they were just friends. Down in the mortal realm, humans were arguing. That might not be very surprising to many, but to put it more specifically, the archaeologists standing in the entry room of Dethos's temple were arguing over the meaning of the painting they had discovered. The frieze in question was very delicately being dried with specialist sponges and cloths to ensure the paint wasn't further damaged. The specialists had been called to gently peel away the moss that was growing over the depiction of the second character, in the hope that there was still paint underneath it that could possibly be saved if it was removed whilst it was still wet. Scraping off dried moss was sure to make whatever lay beneath disintegrate. It was highly likely that it was damaged to the point where there wasn't any paint left underneath, that it was entirely gone, but whilst there was still some hope that the depiction would be stabilized, they were willing to put the effort into doing so. Whatever could have Whatever could be saved would be vital for trying to figure out who this mysterious being was. So far, all that could really be seen was one of their hands, which was tightly holding the hand of the undamaged painting beside it. Any little detail was going to be studied, from the colour of their clothes to the style of the shoes they were wearing. The mysterious other person was something they were very interested in. It was rare to see depictions of more than one deity at a temple unless the beliefs around them were highly entangled. If the second deity was someone that still had a following, they may be able to learn something about the one this temple was dedicated to through the beliefs attached to the other. Even if the mutual belief hadn't survived intact, the second religion Even if the mutual belief hadn't survived intact in the second religion this long, there might be some crumbs as to who this person was. The juniors escaped the arguments of their seniors in the entry of the temple and began milling around the place looking at the other paintings that the senior members had so far ignored. They were spoilt for choice, as almost every inch of the room had some sort of painting or decorative carving. Those that were small tended to be of wheat and bread tied in intricate knots or covered in delicate patterns, like someone's sourdough TikTok. Oh my god! Imagine if you if you made a really good bread, they just carve a depiction of it into the side of the temple, like a temple Instagram page. Oh, that amuses me more than it should. Here and there were depictions of the unknown god digging holes, putting bread into a hole, planting wheat, harvesting wheat, giving it to people, and two people standing side by side balancing a highly decorative bread on the top of their joined hands. There was another depiction of the same two people offering that same bread to the god who was smiling down on them from the top of a haystack holding a doll made of wheat straw, a doll that was then later exchanged for the bread, and the two people held with smiles on their faces. This was a temple to a very obviously highly loved god. Everything in the temple was expensive, either because of the materials or the hours it would have taken many very highly talented craftsmen to complete. You didn't spend this amount of time and money in an agricultural society without a good reason to do so. If the paintings, architecture, and fancy tiling didn't give you that impression, then the statue of the yet unnamed god that stood in the middle of the room should. It looked like it should be breathing if it was so lifelike. The folds in its clothing were hanging so perfectly that you could imagine the weight of the cloth. At the base of the statue, the archaeology students found a thick layer of coloured dust-like particles. It was a different colour than that of the statue. Many of the tile, any of the tiles that it stood upon, or the dirt and debris that they had dug through to get here. Several people took samples that they could take back and analyze later. It seemed like it was likely to be the remains of paint that had once covered the stone, but that had been all but lost to the ravages of time. If there was one thing that you learned as an archaeologist, it was to document anything and everything you found, however insignificant it might seem. In 20 years, there might be a new technology that could tell you the answer to a question you hadn't even thought to ask on the dig. Keeping everything properly labeled and stored meant that you could go on to ask those questions later on down the line. Ta Taking those things properly and in a way that allowed conservation of the site to happen could make you someone's hero down the line. They would be thanking you for having the foresight and the dedication to do your job properly so that they could easily do theirs. Digging was destructive. You couldn't put everything back in the way that you found it, so it was even more important to do everything right the first time. No one could know if something was going to be very important later on and provided new understanding that completely changed how the site was viewed. This position and colouring at the approximate time this temple was built was used to depict married couples in tombs, one of the seniors argued, pointing out the stance of both the figures in the painting were in and the delicate shade of green that the god on the left was wearing. We don't know whether the paintings were made at the same time as the building was erected, said another, pointing to the way the rafters met the ridge apex several metres above them all. Colours had Colours had cultural significance that couldn't be ignored, but the meaning behind them was fluid. It often changed over time from place to place. At one time, people had demanded that baby boys be dressed in pink and girls in blue before it switched at some point, and now it was almost universal that that was how you dressed a child. Most of the world saw the colour yellow as bright and cheery, a joyful colour, but to the small island nation of Marasso, it was the colour of pain. This isn't a tomb, though. That was true. It was a temple. Grave paintings were often stylized in particular ways that other paintings weren't. How do we know they weren't brothers, or friends, or co workers? always had to be someone arguing that a clearly queer couple had to be the best friends instead. How could they know that they weren't just co-working gods that just liked to dress in marriage clothes for laughs on a Friday? The historians will say they were just friends, but archaeologists, and at least the younger ones, thought that there was more to say. How do we know that they're both male? This one held more water. Only one of the figures was fully visible, and until they had fully removed the moss and assessed the damage that lay beneath it, they wouldn't be much the wiser. All they really had to go on right now was their height in comparison with the other god and the thickness of their arm. Who was to say that he hadn't married a goddess of the forge or of battle? Women can be buff too. They didn't depict women like this. How do you know that for certain? When so much from this time is lost, how do you know that the paintings discovered so far that had survived from this era in this region weren't the weird ones? Maybe every single one had depicted women this way. It's like if you think about it, in a future where uh, digital archaeologists exist and we lose all images and videos from 20 the 2020s are just gone, except for not safe for work furry imagery. And they're like, yeah, this is just what they did back then. This is what everyone did. And they base what they thought we were like on that. It would skew everything. Sorry, I just got realized. Yeah, like just imagine the most obscure thing on the internet, and then everything else is gone except that, and then in like 1,000 years, people are talking about how like that was something that we were all doing. Doo, 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 doo. Swan Brothers, was someone really pulling out that old chestnut? Do you look at your co-worker that way? The one senior member of the team in the room asked, their eye twitching as they pointedly stared at the oblivious straight people around them. Men showed affection differently back in the day, the professor in charge of the dig began to say, but they were saved by the others' wrath when the juniors came running out of an adjoining room, shouting loudly about what they had discovered on their travels as they waited for the seniors to stop shouting at each other. The professor was poised to scold them for walking off and deviating from their excavation plan. The other rooms hadn't been tested to see how structurally sound they were yet, but they were interrupted by them shouting out once again. Have you seen the painting in the back room? A junior asked, gesturing back to the room that they just rushed out of. The seniors all shook their heads, both in acknowledgement that they indeed hadn't been out there yet, but also in dismay at them for not following orders that had been drilled into them before they were allowed to come down here to the dig site. Was it too much to ask grown adults not to go wandering off into places that might collapse and crush you to death, or have a massive hole that you could fall into in the dark? They were all going to get scolded, but that could wait until after they shared what they had found that was so interesting they had to run out of the room screaming in excitement. Another junior jokingly added, I don't know what you do with your friends, but I wouldn't call that friendship. He chuckled as everyone turned to look at him. Other juniors cracked smiles, remembering what they had seen and just how adamant almost all of the seniors around them had been that the two couldn't possibly both be male and married to one another. The professor followed them all back round the corner, and their jaw dropped immediately in an entirely comedic manner. What would you call this, my friend? One of the youngsters asked, turning to said friend. Well, I would say, good fellow, that is a very tastefully painted love scene. Though it was indeed very tastefully done. Enough was on show that you could tell what was happening, but not enough that it was overly graphic. Certainly not something you would hang in a reception room where you were planning on having your maiden aunt over to tea in, unless you were fine with never seeing her ever again. Let's be honest though, she doesn't like any of your interior decor decisions in the first place. She doesn't even really like you all that much. She just visits because no one else in the family will listen to the juicy, juicy gossip she likes to spread. I suppose you could do that and not be married to one another? A giggling junior said, having to take a breath after every word to not break down into hysterical laughter. Someone dragged them by the sleeve back into the first room again, for their own safety, as several angry-looking seniors glared back at them. Under this newly discovered and quite frankly massive, tasteful mood, there was another inscription, like the painting in the other room depicting these two gods. It was written in the same indecipherable text that seemed to be unique to this place, but underneath it there was a second inscription, one that used an alphabet commonly used in the countries around the Central Sea. It was something that they could actually read because, whether by sheer luck or destiny, it was the script of the country they themselves had travelled all the way here from, in search of the secrets held by the ornamental stone that had been found in the field. Wedding of Dethos, god of wheat, and Elgaldia, god of peace treaties. Is that not Elgaldia, the god of war? Someone asked, mouth agape at just how small he was in this painting, if it was true that it was him. It seemed as though the well-known god of war and peace might have a somewhat hidden past. The belief in him must be even older than was currently thought. It seemed that they had found out a hell of a lot more secrets than they had even thought possible, and it was going to take even more work to uncover them fully. Mini theatre. Junior, what are you doing? Junior 2, taking a picture. What for? Junior 2, scientific purposes? Senior, you better not have used actual flash photography on that 4,000-year-old plus extremely delicate painting. End of chapter 55. Chapter 56. The Emperor Disturbed. The Emperor of Heaven was holding court. It was actually a pretty important meeting. He didn't hold court that often anymore, and when he did, it was usually over something petty that other people were plenty capable of dealing with without him having to really even know that it was going on. It was amazing how much time you could waste with unnecessary meetings, and it seemed like Julvinus was the master of it. Being the Emperor of Heaven wasn't as authoritative as one might expect it to be. It had been in the past, when he was younger and the deities had made up the heavenly realm, were fewer in number. Back then, Julvinus had reigned over the heavenly realm as the Emperor, and back then, that had actually meant something. He'd told people what to do, and they'd listened to it. One look from him had been enough to scare even the most senior of them. He still had as many followers, but things were different now. These days it was a lot more like herding cats that were in turn herding their own cats, who were herding their own cats. It was cats. It was cats the whole way down, an ever-increasing cat pyramid scheme. For just two payments of $9.98, you $9.99.98, not $9.98. I'm sorry, that's too cheap. $99.98. You too could have a position in the heavens where no one listens to you. Most of the duties of the god of as the god of emperors. No, most of the duties of the job as emperor were looking busy whilst also looking pretty, and that stuff took a lot of effort and money to achieve. Whilst he was thinking about it, Julvinus made sure to pencil in his appointment with the goddess of beauty about his hair. Today, however, was going to be different. In that it was already busy. He was currently embroiled in an argument with several council members who were pretty pissed off that he hadn't told them personally that Dethos wasn't 100% dead. Many of them had helped finance the God of Wheat statue in the memorial garden within the palace of the emperor, and were feeling now that maybe it didn't need to have been quite so expensive or big or gold, but there's no takey backsies on war memorial art, so they were just going to have to get over themselves. It was time to move on. Someone had burst in through what was meant to be a heavenly guarded door at a rather opportune moment. He didn't want to listen to their complaints over what really wasn't that expensive of an object, all things considered. There were things in Heavenly City that could easily dwarf the cost of both the memorial statues. People barely even noticed. At least their money went on something that they could look at once a year and say to people, "Yeah, I helped build that." Someone must have gotten laid because of they bragged about throwing a few coins to a cause they hadn't even participated in. Deities that hadn't even left the four walls of the city. Some of them hadn't even visited the lower city in eons. Dethys had still been a hero even though he hadn't died. Bravery on the battlefield was measured by how dead was bravery on the battlefield wasn't measured by how dead you were at the end of it. Whether you lived or died, what mattered was that you did. What mattered was what you did when the chips were down, and you wouldn't know what you were made of until the dice were thrown. The previous god of war's sacrifice of his life for the sake of everyone living in the heavenly realm and everyone that was to come was certainly something to be applauded and memorialized. He was a martial god. War and all of its horrors was something that he was expected to face. As the god of wheat, the only weapons that he knew how to use were sickles and a threshing flail, and that was only in reference to harvesting wheat. Using them to cut wheat or to encourage the wheat to fall from the husk was very different from using them on a manifested being. It would hurt, obviously, but a plant and a sentient being were on different levels. Rushing into a battlefield was something that he should never have been put in the position to have to do. Asking an agricultural deity to act in the office of a martial deity was unheard of. Everything has happened at least once in the history of the three realms, but in regards to this, there were no records, at least none that had survived. The screaming person who was currently distracting him from the work at hand had arrived just in time for the meeting to take place. Some of the more delicate members of staff were covering their ears in hope that it would block out some of the noise, but it was to no avail. Sylvanus rubbed a white-gloved hand down his face as the meeting he had as the meeting he hadn't wanted to be in the first place descended further and further into unrestrained madness. He could currently feel a lot of pent-up frustration from the morning bubbling away beneath the surface of his carefully built-up emperor facade. In all honesty, he wanted to rage. It'd been a while since he'd been able to gather up his feelings enough that he was actually able to do so. As the cool and stoic emperor, as the cool and stoic emperor, he had to stuff a lot of feelings down in himself, feelings which hadn't magically disappeared the moment that he had put them somewhere out of reach. Jovinus hadn't properly raged in what felt like thousands of years. It was a lid that grew harder to remove every year, leaving it seething somewhere out of sight. There was a reason he kept a room full of chipped dishes and a dartboard in the cellar, somewhere he could vent away from the eyes of his subjects. He wished his consort, Meliubs, was here. Meliub's best name. The whole series, fight me. Meliubs has a name from a demon general. He wished his consort Meliubs was here. They were always better at dealing with chaos than he was. Now that the loud intruder to their meeting was most of the way across the room, all that all that were gathered could actually hear clearly what they were saying. "There's a problem," they shrieked, almost slipping on the smooth surface of the floor as they ran. The squeaking noise that their shoes made as they came closer and closer was highly annoying. The Emperor made a mental note to make a new rule that no one was allowed to address him whilst wearing noisy shoes. It was pretty easy to see that there was a problem. Jovinus had surmised that much on his own. The screaming had been a clue. No one made it this far into his palace screaming without being challenged by his guards. If there wasn't a massive problem happening somewhere in his domain, that was why he had so many of them, and the pay was so good. Well compensated staff actually enjoyed coming into work, and when they enjoyed their job, they were more They were very proactive in carrying it out, being able to pay being able to pay your staff salary good enough to for them to actually care about their incredibly boring job was something very few people could afford. Jovinus could admit that he knew he was one of the heavenly realm's most privileged members. It was something he liked to flash around. No point in having something if you never used it. If you save things up for too long, they become useless. Arrangements like that were supposed to ensure that no one was running into his meetings screaming like Bulmar had resurrected and was standing at the doorstep sipping coffee. Drovinus shivered just thinking about the former demon lord. Bulmar was not something that he wanted to think about so early in the morning, especially when he was supposed to be actually working. Being the emperor was hard. Even if this person had managed to break through all the guards and the protections of the palace, there were very few that could ever make it out again, and he willed them to stay. He had some of the best security in the entirety of the heavenly realm. Despite recent events that he also did not want to think about, it turned out that the unexpected visitor was Ugtar, the god of messages. His face was impossible to confuse with anyone else's. You need to come quickly, Ugtar shouted, his voice beginning to take on a tone of panic that was even more obvious than the just straight up screaming had been. It hadn't been there before until now. The Emperor saw his face and immediately ran out onto the balcony. And once out there, he saw a lot of leaves. Is this Dethos's work? He asked, in some degree of awe at the sheer depiction of power that lay before him. The advisors who finally caught up with him were also hit with horror and awe at the extent of a new leafy intrusion into the city. His powers had been very odd since he awakened. An advisor with a long white beard pondered. I thought he was a god of love, someone shouted from somewhere in the back, unwilling to show their face, but definitely willing to be dramatically loud in an indoor sacred space. He is technically a fertility god, Jolvina stated, before looking back out over the sea. It's getting closer. Is it getting closer? He asked, beginning to get concerned for his own palace's safety, as the leaves crept closer and closer to where they were all standing. Yes, Ugtar stated, waving at the vast expanse of leaves unfurling before them in a rather annoyed manner. Um, Come on, go get a nature deity, the Emperor of Heaven commanded, sending an advisor running off in search of someone that knew absolutely anything about plants. Considering the situation, it definitely classed as as an emergency. Finding a high-powered nature deity was going to be important for dealing with this currently quick-spreading botanical infestation. Mini theatre, Arthur. So, I didn't sleep last night. System. You should have went to sleep earlier. Arthur. I did. System. 1 a.m. is not early. I forgot to do system twice again. Arthur. When you have the unholy union of chronic insomnia and chronic pain, 1 a.m. might as well be 8 p.m. Isn't that the problem though? That isn't the problem though. Probably is the problem though. That isn't the problem though. The problem is I didn't sleep and I'm streaming writing this on Twitch and my spelling is embarrassingly bad. I did stream writing this last year. Joel Venus, what's streaming? Arthur gently pushes him out of the room. Not now, dear. Adults are talking. End of chapter 56. And we're going to read 57. 57 is the last chapter we're going to read today. I am pretty sure. Yes. Chapter 57. Leaves. Leaves everywhere. Small park where Elgaldi and Tethos had been resting was the epicenter of the heavily leaf-themed explosion, but it was rapidly encompassing the rest of the city and growing increasingly denser. They had both been picked up by the fast-sprouting vines. but Dethos had rocketed far higher above the god of war. Algaldia could no longer see him. Scattering rainbows of light from its many hanging glass crystals, the camellia-shaped suncatcher was hanging from one of the thinner vine tendrils, suspended in an array of light that had made its way through the canopy of leaves. As the vine continued growing, it swayed slightly, causing the suspended crystals to shiver and spin lazily. Tiny spots of rainbow light followed its movement, dancing across the shadowed plant stalks. If he could see Dethos and know that he was actually okay, this would probably be a pretty cool experience. It was beautiful, and he now knew what it felt like to be an ant in a bean field, but he couldn't dwell on that thought as anxiety had begun to climb its way up his chest. Dethos, he shouted, trying to use the weak god's voice to gauge where he was, but he couldn't hear anything in response. He shouted several more times in increasing panic and loudness, but continued to get the same result for his effort. That was when he truly started to panic. Dethos had been upset before they even got here. The two of them had run through half the city, and Elgaldia was still marveling at his legs, not giving out on him. If they had been left alone up here at the park in the quiet darkness, maybe Elgaldia would have been able to console him. Maybe if he hadn't been so distressed earlier today, this wouldn't have happened. The vine holding him was thick, and despite his wiggling, he hadn't moved an inch. Dethos, he screamed. Dethos was using so much power to create this that that if he wasn't already worried about his safety, he definitely was now. Dethos's emotional state is certainly not being helped by the sudden arrival of a certain sparkly pink goddess. What she'd said was something that he'd wanted to take Dethos aside to say at some point relatively soon, and he was furious that the opportunity had been taken away from him. It should have been me that told him, Melgaldia thought. I should have ignored them and just told him. It's not like he could have waltzed into their first meeting in the hospital and opened with, "Hey, how you doing, babe? I'm Melgaldia, god of war and peace. I went feral, almost murdered you 4,000 years ago. Oh, by the way, we were married at the time. Here's your ring back. Let's shack up." Maybe holding it Maybe holding it in for this long was a bad idea, because now he'd gotten the information from one of the worst possible sources at exactly the wrong time and place. Maybe the god of war hadn't been expressly told not to tell Dethos the full truth about the nature of their past relationship. Maybe if the god of war hadn't been expressly told not to tell Dethos the full truth about the nature of their past relationship, he could have told him back in the garden. Back when they had both talked about their memories of the Battle of Wind-Blown Tears for hours until the sun had set and risen once more. His possibly overprotective tendency towards Dethos was just as dangerous as everyone else's. It had hurt the person that valued being informed and allowed to, to make his own decisions when that was exactly the opposite of what he had intended. There wasn't a secret in the three realms that could be kept so for very long. Heavenly deities, humans in the mortal realm, and the deities of the underworld were all massive, unrepentant gossips. Gossiping made the world turn round, and each was as bad as the other. Algaldi had hoped that his husband would have recovered memories of their relationship by this point, and he wouldn't have had to break the news to him. It was really rather selfish on his own part, not wanting the awkwardness that revelation would bring to seep into their friendship they had managed to cobble together somehow. Meant that right now it might have all just blown up in his face. No matter how much he struggled, the vines only tightened around him, leaving Elgaldi with no other choice. He pulled a sword out of his dimensional ring, grateful that he at least still had the use of the full range of both his arms. Elgaldia swung the sword's sharp edge down onto the vine next to him. The thwack sound it made as it embedded itself into the bark-like outer skin of the vine was drowned by the screaming from somewhere high above, high-pitched and heavily laden with pain. It was the screams of Dethos. Elgaldi was horrified. He'd hurt him again. Their relationship was really starting to feel cursed. The cursed mind controlling demon poison he had been infected with should really have pointed that out for him. What were the odds of being sliced by a blade coated in it twice in one day? Probably very small, almost suspiciously small, and an inevitable destiny. He lost grip of his sword and it fell to the ground far below him, impaling itself into the soil, blade first, and reverberating back and forth from the impact. He'd never be able to hold this blade again, not something that had hurt Dethos. They had to reforge the last sword he'd stabbed his beloved wheat god with, because you couldn't discard the god of war's sword. He tried just about everything too. Oh. Throwing it off the side of the cloud, which held up the entire city, that had only resulted in it returning angry and ready to slice him in retaliation. There may also have been the time when Algaldi attempted to drop it into a volcano, and and had molten metal fly at him, reforming into the sword that had just left his hand. The thought that he'd hurt his husband badly enough for him to scream, and he couldn't even see to assess the damage, hurt more than Bulmar's scythe ever had. The scythe in question had been covered in a thick layer of mind-controlling demon poison, a poison that was corrupting not only to the mind but also the body. It ate away at his flesh and prevented it from healing for many years after the wounds were inflicted. The veritable forest of vines that had grown up around the bench seemed to be connected to the god of wheat's manifested form in some way. Algalde may not have known much about farming or wheat, despite being friends with and later married to a deity of agriculture, specifically wheat and wheat byproducts, but he knew that the vines weren't wheat. They weren't some wild plant that you found in a wheat field either. He would know, he'd seen a lot of them. Tethys has been so Tethys had so very kindly left him a collection of them when he'd last visited at the War Department's administrative office. This was a botanical issue that was plausibly going to take several specialist plant-related deities to deal with, and he was certainly not one of them. Looking at the denseness of the plants surrounding him, he thought that they might need to call a mother willow to come out from her garden to deal with the problem of this magnitude. The god of war was drawn out of his thoughts by an annoyed throat clearing from somewhere beneath him. He looked down for the first time since being lifted off the ground, and there, also entwined in vines, was the severely pissed off goddess of love, staring up at him, only a few meters from the fallen sword. Her hair looked like she'd been dragged through the hedge backwards. It stuck up at odd angles, seemed to contain about a small bush's worth of twigs and leaves. Her dress was covered in mud all up one side, as if she'd slipped and fallen. Its pink sequins glittered in the low light whenever the rainbows cast by the glass camellia hit it. How hadn't he noticed her before? Hopefully she hadn't fallen into the pond where the birds had been, as the mud and water there stunk, its strong odour almost impossible to clean away because it clung to fabric with its mouldy tang. Last time someone had fallen in, they'd had to burn the clothes, and everyone that had helped them out had to burn theirs as well. It was just that pungent. A lot of clothes were bought that day. Hopefully the deities involved in making them got paid well. Vibrations were still passing through the sword, where it had fallen, blade first, into the soil below, and even though it was so far away, Algaldi could hear the strange sound it made as it flexed back and forth. Hopefully the fallen impact hadn't done the vines any damage on the way down. Though he hadn't heard any subsequent screams from his husband that could have been due to him now being out of hearing distance, the vines were still growing. He would have thought that the heavily sequined bright pink would have made the goddess of love easier to see. Maybe he just had that little interest in her. Right now she was demanding his attention and doing so rather loudly. So you didn't tell him? She demanded. If she hadn't had her hands restrained by the angry vines, Algaldi could tell from her demeanour that she would be jabbing him in the chest with one of her elegantly manicured talons. He made note to thank Dethos later for his vines restraining and holding her far enough away for that not to happen. I wouldn't have thought that was pretty I would have thought that was pretty obvious by now. He lost his memory. I didn't want to force my way back into his life after everything that I did, Elvaldia tried to explain, as she death glared up at him. Perdita was doing what I could Perdita, I was doing what I could to keep him alive. Perdita looked like she was going to respond angrily again, but Ugaldi had finally found the place where his own anger lay. He remembered how Dethos had been left to sort all the prayers himself, how he'd been the only one to visit the palace to see him, when he had moved back after the initial rush to greet him, how he'd been the only one who seemed like he was planning for and awaiting his turn. His return. Not turn. Awaiting his turn. Spelling problems. How he'd been the only one who seemed like he was planning for and awaiting his return. Plenty of deities across the city were all too ready to attend the memorial and cry about how they were close to him and would give anything to have him back with them. Strange how that the moment he was back, they had all disappeared. Not even a bunch of flowers or a hastily purchased get well soon card. Now that he was more settled back into his own routine and proving that he wasn't back only to be pulled apart by people who suddenly decided that they were suddenly available again. People were starting to remember he existed. Better with their friends. Why didn't you know? I thought love was your domain. Ilgaldia spat out. The vines were starting to sway in the breeze, and the nausea he was experiencing wasn't helping his temper. Why has no one from your department been here to support him? No one told me. That was a lie. There couldn't be a singular being across the entire three realms that didn't know. When else had something like this ever happened? It had been months since his return. I thought he was under your protection, she said with an accusatory raise of her eyebrows. They were just about the only thing Fadite was capable of moving now that the vines had a stranglehold upon her. There had been a time when the goddess of love had taken him aside and made him vow to her that he would love and protect Dethos. She'd also made it blatantly clear that she didn't like the two of them dating. He's under my protection, so if anything happens to him because of you, feel ready to experience my wrath. And he had. He had truly felt Fadite's wrath. Life as a love deity is busy in spring, she sighed. It feels like everyone and everything wants to be trying to make babies as soon as the days get more than 5 seconds longer. Fadita pulled a face and tried to remove a vine that had started encircling her neck. She'd moved her neck aggressively around in circles the opposite direction from the way it was trying to wind in order to make it let go of her. And finally here, after taking a break before the summer beach season, she looked tired, the sort of tiredness that someone could only feel after having to deal with a lot of problems. It was tiredness he had seen often on the face of Dethos after the harvest was finally in, but it did not dissipate his own bubbling annoyance. I'd like to know who thought it would be a good idea. Did not inform me, she bristled. There was still silence from up above, and try hard as they might, neither still could see hide nor hair of Dethos. Mini theatre. News reporter. Strange events have been seen happening in the middle city. New vine-like growths have been seen filling the streets. Please keep an eye out whilst you're doing your shopping today. Weather reporter. We're seeing sky-high amounts of vines in the air today, so if you're planning to go out today, remember to take precautions. Field reporter. I'm coming to you live from my place in the sky, attached to this plant. Hopefully someone will come and sort this out sooner rather than later because I'm currently trapped here. End of chapter 57. That is where we end for today. Let me look at my thing. Right. That was a lot, wasn't it? It's it's certainly not a stream by me if something doesn't go crazily wrong. But I feel like the internet connection is a lot stronger now. And that's good. So we're not reading more next week. I'll probably do something else. Maybe arts, maybe crafts, maybe the art of the craft. I don't know. um, Sunday is modded Minecraft stream. You can watch me potentially die several times because I do stupid things or I don't know what things are. It will actually have sound this time though, because I forgot that I'd switched desktop audio off my on OBS. And that was what was the problem. Just it was under so many different sources for me to see it. But I will see it then. We will we'll certainly do something. So this is me think goodbye. Stay safe out there. Don't run with scissors. Wash those handies. Look both ways before you cross the road. And I'll see you on Sunday. Bye bye. Bye bye. Bye bye.